Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Seamless Shift, Ensuring Business Continuity when Switching from Gas to Cordless Technology. I'm your moderator, Jimmy Miller, an associate editor with Lawn & Landscape Magazine. Before I toss it to them to lead the charge, let's introduce today's speakers. First, we have Nick Feld, a senior product manager of outdoor power equipment at Chevron North America. With over 20 years of expertise in product management and sales, Nick has led the launch of Ego Commercial's innovative PGX commercial charging system, transforming how landscapers refuel. Before joining Chevron, Nick developed his expertise at industry leaders Bosch, Werner, and Medline, where he held key roles in product management and sales. His extensive background in developing industry-leading products and commercialization strategies continues to drive significant advancements in the industry. Nick resides in the greater Chicago area and enjoys woodworking, exercise, and competing with his identical twin brother to achieve the most perfectly striped diagonal lawn. We also have Conrad Tufte, the senior product manager of outdoor power equipment as well at Chevron North America. With over 6 years at Ego, Conrad has been instrumental in launching several flagship products, including the Select Cut walk-behind mowers and the Z6 zero-turn riders. He also spearheaded the expansion into new cordless OPE categories, such as the two-stage snow throwers and mini bikes that were industry firsts to match or exceed the power of gas. Before joining Chevron, Conrad built a strong foundation in the bike industry with roles at Specialized and Giant, where he excelled in B2B sales. His deep expertise in developing market-leading products and commercialization strategies continues to drive innovation in the DC outdoor power market, or in the DC outdoor power equipment sector. Conrad lives in the greater Chicago area and enjoys hiking, fishing, hunting, and camping with his family, including his son. Guys, take it away.
Thanks, Jimmy, for the warm introduction. And to all on the line, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be, and thanks for attending today. Conrad, welcome. Thanks for joining me on our journey today to talk a little bit about transitioning from gas to battery. So we're going to start in a moment by covering some basics that we think many professional landscapers could really benefit from. And we're going to start with a poll question in just a second. But before that, regardless of the role that you may play in the professional landscaping community, there's one thing that everyone can agree on, and that is time is money. And maximizing uptime is critical, right? That's one of the most important things that we want to keep in mind today as we walk through how to navigate the waters of transitioning from gas to battery. But first, let's queue up a quick poll question. So to get a little better understanding about you as an audience, we'd like to know what best describes your interest in cordless outdoor power equipment. For example, do you have a local or state law or ordinance that's forcing you in this direction? Perhaps your customers are asking for battery products to be used because, we're waiting for the poll question to come up here. A little technical difficulty.
Yeah, everyone's up now. You're good.
All right, great. Sorry about that. Perhaps your customers are asking for battery products to be used because they could be more quiet than their gas powered equivalents. Or maybe you feel that there are certain workflow efficiencies to be gained by using cordless, right? So think about those. Think about which one matters most to you or which one is most applicable to you. Take a few moments and then submit your answer. And be sure to hit that submit button when you're done. That's kind of important. Give it a few seconds here to kind of let that roll in. Very interesting.
Like a third.
Yeah. All right, looks like we got everything in there. So yeah, very interesting. It's about a third. Not super surprising, to be perfectly honest, because when you take a look at the geographical differences, there's a lot of different things going on depending on where you're at in the country. So whatever your answer may be, we've heard it all, to be honest. And here at Ego, we've had the opportunity to talk with so many different types of landscapers. On one end of the spectrum, some businesses are still 100% committed to gas and just are not willing to budge anytime soon. On the other end of the spectrum, there are businesses who are adopting battery products willingly and have learned to make their businesses, a little bit more profitable. And then, of course, there's everybody in between, right, Conrad? Because it's a mixed bag, to be honest. And you take states like California, for example, kind of being forced in that direction.
You have everything from statewide ordinances to out east and in the south having just some noise ordinances around, like, say, backpack blowers, that kind of thing. So we certainly even sometimes you'll have like a random HOA. So actually diving into all that and understanding where those heat maps are, but it's pretty widespread throughout the country now, and how to best navigate those waters can be a little bit murky for sure.
Yeah, interestingly enough, when we think about COVID and certainly post-COVID times, there are actually landscapers that were finding that they could actually charge more by switching to cordless, and then they would offer that as an additional service or an additional value add.
And actually picking up off that, there's even some of those HOA ordinances revolve around people working from home, and out of COVID, more people now just work from home. And if you're working from home and you're hearing a bunch of backpack blowers in apartment buildings, condos, that kind of thing, it's really, really problematic. So you have landscapers and HOAs like forcing the landscaper that does the work, forcing them to adopt cordless to some extent.
Yep. Shelby, we're one slide ahead. Back. Okay. Looks like we're missing a slide, but that's okay. But we've got a few questions that we tend to hear commonly in the industry. They reflect hear what our team has heard when we talk about landscapers, talking about their concerns, their thoughts about switching to cordless. Interestingly enough here, though, the order that you see is not what I would say is typically representative of the order in which we are asked the questions. Most of the time, the landscapers will lead with question number 3, which is, how do I make sure my crews don't run out of juice? Again, this goes back to the time is money, right? And the need for maximum uptime. And this is where they start to appreciate all the difference in brands and options, voltage platforms, et cetera. But then once they make a decision on a cordless system, then they quickly realize, oh gosh, maybe I need to upgrade my trailer, or go to a new vehicle or a van. And then they start to think about how they're going to deploy power to those trailers or vehicles in an effort to power their charging systems. And then once they investigate that a little further, they discover something else they hadn't thought about. And that is, oh man, do I upgrade my electrical service to give me enough juice to handle my new equipment? So the reason we have these questions in this particular order, though, is because we try to help folks understand that it's better to plan ahead, right? It's better to understand the kind of building you're operating out of, and whether or not that might require some upgrades. And from there, you start to think about the impact that may have on your vehicles and whether or not those adjustments will need to be made there or beyond. Or perhaps new vehicles are needed, right? Or can you get by on what you have? So lots to consider. So from there, which platform do you choose, and what kind of equipment and batteries will it take for you to power your crews all day? How much space will that take up, and what's the best way to organize and use that equipment in order to develop better workflow efficiencies? Will you need to consider additional batteries to handle the power spikes in demand that you'll see, going from one season to another? For example, fall leaf cleanup. Last but not least, we'll talk about how to service and maintain your cordless products, because again, maximizing uptime is critical. And the less time you're spending repairing your equipment, the more efficient your business is running. But before we get into those questions a little bit deeper, we think it'd be helpful to cover a few basics as it relates to some technical stuff. So with that, welcome to Electricity 101. You might ask, why are we going to talk about electricity? Well, because understanding some electrical basics will actually help you understand batteries a little more. And Conrad, this isn't like super rocket science type stuff, right? This is basic stuff, but ultimately what we're trying to get people to do is help them understand how understanding basics can help them navigate and be better as they plan their days, plan their weeks of work as it relates to battery products, right? So we're not going to get deep into physics or chemistry or math here or anything like that, but let's talk a little bit about some key terms, okay? So first, starting with watts, which is really important. What is a watt? See what I did there? Watts are actually a unit of power. So the more watts you have, the more power you have. Think of it like that. Or think of it like your car's engine, right, in horsepower. The greater amount of horsepower you have, the more powerful that engine is. And then there's volts, and then there's amps, which are also some other important terms to be aware of when it comes to electricity. Volts are what we would call a unit of electrical potential, which is just another fancy way of saying pressure. And when we talk about amps, amps is a measure of current, which is another fancy way of saying how much juice is flowing through. But wait, you might say, electricity is visible and I can't see it, right? So another analogy we like to use is when we think about water. So imagine water for a second. In this case, voltage would be analogous to a pressure in the pipe or pressure in the hose, right? Current then would be analogous to, say, the size of the hose or the amount of water flowing through it. So in this case, as it relates to electricity, it would be the amount of electrons flowing through. So what the heck does this have to do with watts and power, you might be saying? Well, because the really important question here is to remember that watts equals volts times amps. Okay, so if watts equals power, then what about fuel capacity, right? Because that's the one thing a lot of people are very quick to talk about, like how long can I actually work? How do we measure that? So again, going back to your car as an example, your gas tank holds only so much fuel at a time. That fuel is the energy that powers that engine in order for your car to drive. So how do we reimagine that in electrical terms so that you can better understand your battery? The answer is watt hours. Watt hours are the unit of energy capacity in the battery pack instead of gallons in your car tank. But what you might ask, isn't that the same as amp hours, which is printed on the battery? Because when you look market wide, every manufacturer has the voltage, and then they got the amp hours. And Conrad, amp hours are created equally, aren't they?
Yeah, well, amp hours aren't, but
Exactly, that was your question. So no, they're not. Well, actually, the answer really is kind of sort of, and this is where things kind of get interesting. And the answer is no, not all amp hours are created equally. For example, if we take like an 18 volt, 8 amp hour battery, and then an 8 volt or an 8 amp 60 volt battery, they may sound like they're the same because they're both 8 amp hours, but when you actually do the energy calculation, which is calculated by taking your volts times your amp hours to get your watt hours, you'll find that the 60 volt battery has much higher energy capacity. So amp hours is really only a good comparison of capacity in a battery, but only when you're comparing different voltages or the same voltage, sorry. We'll talk a little bit about that more in some upcoming slides. But first, another term you'll start to hear a little bit more about is associated with larger or higher capacity batteries, and that's the kilowatt hour. And really for the kilowatt hour, you just have to do a little bit of conversion math. You'll see that conversion down in the lower right. And basically that's just another way of expressing watt hours for a much larger number of amp hours. So here what you see is a quick reference listing for max and nominal voltages for all your key brands in the market. But what does this mean, you might ask? Well, max voltage is the voltage of any battery pack when it's fully charged. So that's what you see in the column on the left. Your nominal voltage is the average voltage of a battery pack as soon as you start to deplete that battery down to a low state of charge. So why do some manufacturers choose one versus the other? Well, it has a little bit to do with history. And there's some legal things that took place back in the early days of lithium ion, especially in Europe. Manufacturers were required to actually report on the nominal voltage, but in the U.S. there's a little bit more gray area here.
It comes down to like it's a weird shipping quirk of like so like a steel who started theirs in Europe, they were required to report it as 36 volt, a nominal voltage. And then in here, because of some shipping stuff, everybody seemed to put max voltage on, and so there is a little it's a confusion. Clear as mud.
Yeah, and that's why you'll see some manufacturers actually brand with 56 volt max or 20 volt max, right? And that's really kind of for the newer platform manufacturers. They've since moved to that max calculation because it's a little less confusing. And it represents, when the battery has, the full 100% stated charge. So just a little bit of trivia there for you. So here's actually the calculation for watt hours again. And really, there's two ways to calculate this. You got what we refer to as the gross, and then also the rated watt hours. So using, for example, an Ego Arc Lithium 8 amp hour battery here, you can see how we calculate both the gross watt hours. And what we're doing here is we're taking 56 volts times 8 amp hours, right? And remember that 56 volts is that max voltage. So that's when the voltage is at 100% state of charge for the battery. So it's the simple calculation is that voltage times the amp hours, and that's what gets you 448 gross watt hours. But this is actually not what you'll always what you'll get, because again, the max voltage starts to deplete, once you start to use the battery. And to kind of reiterate what Conrad was saying, just so the point was clear, you'll see the max rating on things like, the battery labels themselves, as well as, marketing materials, packaging, that kind of thing. And a large reason for that is because, the shippers of the world, UPS, FedEx, DHL, they require that max or gross rating for hazmat shipping purposes. That's a really important point worth noting. The nominal wattage, or the nominal rating, or in this case, the nominal watt hours, is what you get by taking the nominal voltage. In the case of Ego, it's 50.4 volts times your same amp hours, 8 amp hours, and that's what gets you the 403 nominal watt hours. So the nominal watt hours is what you as a landscaper would use to do some basic calculations about how much usable energy is in that battery pack. So
I was just saying,
Yeah.
a really good way of comparing batteries to if you're sitting there thinking like what platform to get into, what voltage should I go with? You start thinking like, well, a bigger battery, and that gets my watt hours up. There could be other disadvantages of big battery, but a smaller battery, I need more of them to have enough watt hours. So it's a good way of sort of like taking different brands and sort of applying some basic sort of electrical math to whatever it is you need to do, and spitting out and being able to compare different companies' batteries, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And for those of you that haven't done the investigation, Conrad's exactly right. With the lower voltage platforms, the basic takeaway is you'll need that many more batteries to complete the same amount of work, right? All right. I think we're actually ready for another poll question, to be honest with you. So let's hit into that real quick. And this poll question has to do with battery technology, battery chemistry. If you're not familiar with these technologies, don't feel too bad, because a lot of this stuff is relatively new to the market. It's constantly evolving. But basically, what we're looking at here. We have the poll question.
That's up.
That's okay. So there's a number of different cell types out there. So pouch cells. This is relatively new. You might have heard of it. Pouch cells are very thin rectangular cells, kind of like a little thin wafer, pretty much what you'd find in your Android or iPhone mobile device, right? They have a number of benefits like higher max discharge capability, or simply more power out, higher power discharge, right? The other nice benefit that they have is faster recharging because of how they're designed. Tablet cells is probably one of the newest cell types out there that you may or may not have heard of. And tablet cells basically have performance attributes that are similar to pouch, but they're cylindrical in shape, just like most standard cells out there. So think about like your standard Duracell AA battery. That's a cylindrical cell. And then of course there's good old lithium ion cells, which is what most of the market still is. So to get to our poll question here, which one of those will actually deliver the most watt hours, right? We just talked about watt hours. Watt hours is the unit of energy. So we're talking about energy capacity. So of those, which one delivers the most? Take some time to think about that.
We already got
Very interesting. So it looks like we've got about 18% say pouch, just under 30% say tablets, and then over 50% say good old-fashioned lithium ion. Well, this is interesting. So the answer here really is that they're all about the same. If you actually had a battery that was exactly the same size for each of these three different technologies, they're going to deliver all about the same amount of watt hours or energy. In other words, very similar gas in the gas tank. So just because the cells are different, capacity is going to be relatively the same. So next, let's talk about maximizing uptime. Okay, so the first question, getting back to our list of 5 from earlier, do I need to upgrade the electrical service in my buildings? So there's been a lot of discussion. We get a lot of questions about this as landscapers start to investigate the changes that they're going to need to consider making. Having the right electrical infrastructure in place where you plan to do your battery charging will be critical to your operation. What I'd recommend is to start out by having an electrician come out, and have them assess what you've currently got in terms of your electrical panel, your full service capability. How much more do you have available in terms of remaining capacity? For example, how many additional 120 volt, whether they're 20 amp or 15 amp breakers, do you have available in your panel? Do you have 240 volt? Get a good sense of that before you start to make any decisions. And then, as you begin to assess different manufacturers' battery platforms, really important here, take a look at their charging solutions to understand how much energy those systems draw, because everyone is going to be different. In the old days where we had standard chargers, they wouldn't have as much of a draw on your electrical grid. And then as battery charging started to advance to what you've seen out there is rapid chargers and turbochargers and things like that, they draw more energy. And that additional energy draw, will put a crimp on your total load. So really start to try to understand that. Chargers are often rated in terms of their input wattage. So the way to think about it is the greater the input wattage, the faster that charger can charge a battery. Keep that in mind, because faster charging will also require more energy, as I was saying, and ultimately that'll mean that you can only plug in maybe a few chargers at a time per circuit, which is great if you only plan to charge a few batteries here and there. But if you're a landscaper who's scaling your business and you're starting to have the need for maintaining a lot of different batteries that you have to charge every day, then you're really going to need a solution that can enable that if you don't want to have to make a lot of changes to your electrical infrastructure. So understanding that is really important. So the big takeaway here is if you choose wisely, then having the right charging solutions means you'll be able to upgrade more than one crew at a time potentially and cover not just your handheld OPE, but also those higher energy, drawing products like backpack blowers and walk behind mowers. And you'll be able to do it by starting it all off of a single circuit.
And I've seen every solution known to mankind to try and get around this, like, whether it be gas generators on the back of pickup trucks charging electric batteries, or them poaching electric off of their customers' houses and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, there's some very novel ways to get around it. But you want to look into that charging solution first and foremost, and how is it going to really affect my infrastructure that I have. Sometimes all you have is like a single cord. So is that enough? So that's important. It's not just the battery, it's not just the tools, but what is the charging solution? You really have to ask yourself that.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty crazy stuff, haven't we? Remember that one time where we walked in and they had all those power strips and what were they? Christmas tree light timers?
Christmas tree timers, yeah.
Oh my gosh, talk about a hazard and a half.
I've definitely hope the fire inspector doesn't come through.
Yeah, right. Where things have become a little different is when you start to look at commercial ZTRs. Electrical requirements, obviously vary from one manufacturer to another. Some have charging options that run off of 120 volt, whether they're 15 or 20 amp circuits, but have a much slower charge rate. So if those machines have a really large battery, then they may not actually be able to be charged to 100% in your overnight period between work days. So for that reason, you should really consider options that help you future-proof your electrical system, especially if it's inevitable that you have an electrician coming out at some point to upgrade your system. So think about installing systems that might even support in the future Level 2 EVSC, which stands for Electrical Vehicle Supply Compatibility, aka an EV wall charger, right? And what that means is having NEMA 1450 compatible outlets or 240 volt outlets available. A good thing to think about for the future. Today, you're thinking about your cordless OPE and upgrading to battery, and for that 120 volts should be good enough for right now. But tomorrow you may be considering upgrading to perhaps an EV truck or a van, right? So planning ahead for how your business might evolve over time means you can better budget ahead for those electrical infrastructure upgrades. So on to the next question. This is Actually, probably a good time to throw in a little bit of a plug for our brand new Ego PGX commercial charging system. With our Ego PGX charging system, you can charge up to 70 batteries or up to 15 kilowatt hours overnight. Key takeaways here: PGX is pretty simple. It requires the power hub, which is the charger, and that's the only charger you need. Runs off of a standard 120 volt 15 amp circuit. You do not need to pay for expensive electrical infrastructure upgrades to get started. PGX is also scalable. The PGX 3-port dock connects to the hub, and that's what allows you to scale up based on your business needs. We've also got an off-grid solution that lets you recharge your Ego batteries on the go. No cables, no grid power needed. Solution is especially helpful when you have to manage energy spikes from one season to another. So it's a really great system. We're very proud of it.
But no gas generators in the back of your truck.
No gas generators, not needed at all. So let's move on to the next question, which is, do I need to upgrade or change my vehicles and trailers? Really important topic. So there's a few things to consider here. For example, weather. Are all the products you're considering that you're using to maintain your customers, are they rated for outdoor storage? As we all know, the better those tools and products are protected when they're not in use, the longer they're going to last. You subject them to rain, that's one thing. You subject them to exposure to UV, that's another thing. There's a lot of things to consider. So weatherability, I should say, is important. Charging. If you're currently operating only with open trailers or pickup trucks, maybe start to imagine using an enclosed trailer or a van at some point down the road. And whether or not you'll be able to charge in those vehicles or trailers versus inside a building, which is a really perfect segue into the third point here, which is security. And this is an interesting one. We actually don't get a ton of questions here. It's more about the insights that we garner from having, visited lots and lots of landscapers. Right, it's probably not the first thing on landscapers' minds, right, Conrad? Because it's something that they haven't had to deal with on the same level. But it is going to be a little bit of a challenge, as you can imagine, because a lot of crews will start to require lots and lots of batteries, and those batteries
became more of a topic conversation a lot in California, where batteries became a pretty common sort of grab and go theft problem. So it's something we really started to see out there as we interviewed landscapers in California.
Yeah, so really the big takeaway here is that enclosed trailers or vans or even box trucks can really help protect against those three things: against the weather, they can improve your charging workflows, and really offer the best security. So moving on to the next question, how do I make sure my crews don't run out of power throughout the day? So as I mentioned early on, this is probably the number one question we get asked most often. And so to think through this, there's really 3 steps. So number one, the first thing we'd recommend is make a list of the equipment you want to convert to cordless, starting with the tools you've already been using. Okay. The second thing is, and you'll find that different manufacturers publish additional resources on their websites, things like runtime guides and other online calculator tools, ROA models, things like that. Use those resources where available. And not only those resources, but the information we just talked about as far as calculating energy needs. Understand the energy you're going to need to run those products throughout the day. The last thing is how and where and when you charge is going to be critically important to your entire business operation and your day-to-day workflow. While it may or may not be obvious to you all, you're really going to want to consider a charge port for basically every battery. Ideally, you want to do most of your charging overnight. It doesn't take away from the work that you're doing for your customers, and electricity costs tend to be less at night. So charging during the day may be required in some cases here and there, especially during times when energy demand is higher, like fall leaf cleanup season, where you'll be using a lot of leaf blowers to manage leaf piles, or maybe ZTRs or walk behind mowers to mulch the leaves instead. But the biggest takeaway here is plan for the worst case energy scenario. As a landscaper, this is something that you'll have to experiment with a little bit to understand what you'll really need. But ultimately, it's about maximizing uptime, right? So maybe, after you calculate that, factor in, a 20% buffer just to be safer than sorry. And that's what takes us to our next topic. How do you manage spikes in power demand? And, before we actually get into that piece, I want to talk a little bit about a brand new tool that Ego has launched called the Power Manager. This is basically a web-based tool. You can see the URL right there in the middle. Don't be afraid to go check that out. It's a web-based tool, but it's also designed to be mobile friendly, so you can use it on your mobile device. Well, the way it works is this. You go into the tool, you answer a few basic questions about your crews, about how they operate, and then you select the equipment that you want to operate. So base it off of how you operate right now. You can then choose from a recommended set of batteries, which then takes the guesswork out of you for what you have to use to power the equipment based on the way you work. And then based on the battery recommendations, it'll recommend the number of charging solutions you'll need to get the job done in time for the next workday. You can save the quoted list of products and you can share that with your dealer to discuss in terms of, purchase pricing, learn about available discounts, deals, that kind of thing. This is a tool that we launched earlier this year. We continue to build on it, make improvements. So obviously there's room for improvement, but it's a great way to start when so many landscapers oftentimes realize that they just don't know when or where to start or the questions to ask to do that. So be sure to check that out. And as a quick pro tip, is beginning to consider different battery options, whether it be Ego commercial or something else. Be sure to consider how you might want to move energy from ZTRs to handheld battery equipment. This probably only applies to anyone currently, considering a battery ZTR today. But think about the future, because that's where things are going. In the next 3 to 5 years, you may be, whether by choice or by force, for example, in California, have to move to a cordless ZTR. So you want to, make sure you've invested in a platform that lets you move that energy around. So let's get into that next when we talk about handling spikes in power demand, because again, really common question. So consider this, 50 to 70% of your upfront cost to convert to battery is really wrapped up in your batteries and chargers. That's a huge and significant part of your investment, right? So this is why we encourage you to think about the future. So in the next 2 to 3 or 5 years, if you're planning down the road to convert to go all cordless, including your ZTRs or wheeled equipment, think about operating on a single platform. You don't want to have to be shifting from one platform to another and then investing in another platform and then another. So think about investing in a single platform, which will support you for the long term. Ultimately, you want to be able to move energy from ZTRs to other equipment, and here's why. So don't let this be an eyesore, but it's really not that complicated. This chart really shows the energy consumption of typical cordless OPE, from everything from large equipment like ZTRs there on the far left to lighter weight hand tools like string trimmers and hedge trimmers. Cordless ZTRs are extremely energy hungry, as you can probably imagine. They will absolutely consume the most energy throughout the day, as much as up to 10, 20 kilowatt hours?
Yeah, totally depends on the application, but yeah, they can, obviously consume a lot of energy. And, to sort of Nick's point, if you have solutions, right, this is, I guess, the shameless plug part, right, where there's like a built-in battery. Well, you're spending money as a landscaper on this built-in battery in a ZTR, but there's times of the year, say during spring and fall cleanup, where you're like, well, I'm not really mowing as much grass, but I'm sure blowing a lot of leaves. So being able to take those batteries and put them and apply them somewhere else where you can use them to charge your smaller handheld batteries, sort of lets you amortize that energy cost and sort of apply it to where you need it based on what you're doing during that time of the year.
Yep. Yeah, that's really what makes those things so darn expensive. You could end up spending up to
somewhere $40,000 and $25,000 of it is tied up in the battery that you can't use for anything else, which we don't see as good value. Our commercial ZTR plan, which we showed at Equip last year, is with removable batteries. Not just you could swap in the middle of the day, but also sort of reapply that energy where you need it throughout the year. Again, fall cleanup's the most obvious one where we are up in Chicago, where we're about to hit leaf season.
Yep. So, ideally here, you want to try and minimize your battery investment because, like we said earlier, it drives a huge part of the total cost. There's different ways to do this. We'll talk a little bit about that coming up, but this is definitely something you want to consider when looking at a battery ZTR. Anyway, so we talked about ZTRs, but as we move a little bit further to the right, you'll see that walk-behind mowers, backpack blowers, things like that are the next most energy-hungry tools there are. So, again, having a battery platform that lets you move that energy physically from one tool to another, or from one category to another category of tools, and lets you take unused energy from your ZTR and power your other tools like this, really key. Some of your smaller battery platforms, so think like in the 18 volt to maybe 40 volt range, they're going to struggle with this a little bit. You'll see some manufacturers that have a dedicated battery that works only with a mower or a backpack blower, right? And that's all that it works with, versus the individual batteries that power the other stuff. And the reason for that is because those other smaller batteries just aren't enough to support the power and the energy requirements. So you've got this bigger battery that's a different platform that isn't as flexible, and in some cases might even require a different separate charger, right? So big takeaway here is consider a battery platform that offers the flexibility for you as a landscaper to move some of that energy, unused energy, from one thing with ease across different categories of products, right? The best versatility. So how do you do that? There's actually 3 different ways to do that we've identified. Every manufacturer will do it a little bit differently. First method is what we call plug-in, or E to E. E to E stands for equipment to equipment. So this is pretty much the most obvious solution out there. Let's say when you buy a commercial ZTR and it's got an integrated 24 kilowatt or even a 30 kilowatt battery in the machine, you probably, like Conrad said, you paid up to $40,000, maybe even $50,000 for that machine, which means that based on what we said, roughly 2/3 of the total cost was for the battery, right? So the way you get energy out of that battery then is to directly transfer out of the machine and into other stuff using a cable and a charger. So you got to carry around additional equipment. This is not the most flexible option. So consider this scenario, kind of like we've said a few times, Conrad, more recently, fall cleanup season. So you're on the job, you've got extra energy in your ZTR, but you really want to use it for your backpack blowers. This means that even if you don't during that day need your commercial ZTR, but you have energy locked up in it, you need to make sure you carry it with you, because that becomes basically your energy bank, right? And then you need the cable and the charger to make that energy transfer. So this can be a big pain. The second method is removable batteries. This is where you have a ZTR that has batteries that can physically be removed without tools, so they're designed that way. And then you can take that and transfer it from one product to another. For example, for those of you that weren't at Equip last year to see our debut of our upcoming commercial ZTR, you'll see it this year. But our Eagle commercial ZTR is designed this way. It uses our high capacity battery. And so you can literally take those batteries that power the ZTR and then excuse me, and then just load them in your trailer by themselves instead of having to haul the entire ZTR. Those same batteries then can be used to power something else, like our brand new PGX power bank, which is our DC charger. And then that's what gives you a more flexible option. Now recharge during the day without needing the ZTR. So it relates to commercial. This is going to be your most flexible option. The last method is what we call swappable batteries. So this is what you'd find in other products, or even Toro or Greenworks, like their residential ZTRs. So this is where you can use the batteries that you use in your handheld products, and then you can swap those and dump them into the back end of your ZTR.
Yeah, we actually have people that use our residential ZTRs for commercial stuff. So it sort of depends again on your application. If you're doing some smaller yards and the like, something like that could work, and you're able to then swap all your batteries together. It is very, very flexible, and the guys that do it seem to like it, but it's a pretty unique scenario where you're able to get by with that sort of little relative runtime against like the runtime of a commercial ZTR. But yeah, it does work. It is possible.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's probably for a residential user probably the most flexible option, but from a commercial standpoint, it's probably the least flexible option, as we kind of talked about before. So again, here overall, that second option to have those removable batteries, that's really what is going to offer you as a commercial landscaper the most flexibility. So the last question in our journey today is, how do I service and maintain cordless products? So there's a couple things here. Think of it this way. There's a lot of similarities that can be made from gas OPE to battery OPE. But in short, if it's not engine related, right? If it's not gas powered, engine related types of stuff, which battery tools obviously don't have, then assume it will still need to be done. So things like lubrication of parts, blade and chain sharpening in the case of chainsaws, pole saws, things like that, or even replacing stringer line and other items that wear
Tree
out,
trimmer heads or something like
or
that.
even the heads.
Yeah,
It's another
can
good
wear out,
example. You're still going to need to have to service those types of things because they're wear items. As far as general cleaning goes, you can still use compressed air. We see that a lot, or even blowers, right? If you got to dust off your ZTR at the end of the day, or that kind of thing, or even you can take a hose to it. Our products are all in the case of Eagle Commercial, at least, they're IPX5 rated, so you shouldn't have to worry about forced air or even water.
No.
Just don't use a pressure washer. That can be bad.
Yeah, depends on what you're squirting.
Yep. So then the next thing here, for electronics and drive systems, lean on your manufacturing partners directly. Fortunately for Ego, we've got a really great face-to-face service tech training team. We do offer that through our corporate office. On occasion, we'll even travel to you, right? We make it really easy.
Those guys run a school once a month on how to fix everything. You leave there with their like personal line phone numbers too.
Yeah.
So from a dealer perspective, I travel and see dealers that like, hey, say hey to the service guys, because they're just like a group of guys who are like, they're definitely mechanics. They're like mechanics, but they actually have interpersonal skills, which is pretty cool. And
Yeah.
and so they're really good on the phone, but they're mechanics, and so they explain stuff well. They build that personal relationship. You have a resource to go to. So if you are unsure outside of training on how to do something, it's really effective, and dealers and landscapes like really like it.
Yep, and we also got all kinds of online training options and dealer service portals and things like that. Last but not least, I wanted to touch on a couple of common failure areas when it comes to cordless tools. Over time, circuit board switches, damaged wires all tend to be among the most common things that we deal with. But big takeaway here, one question that we do tend to get over everything else is regarding brushless motors. And do they actually fail, and do they actually need maintenance? And the short answer is no, they generally do not fail. Once in a while, you might see a motor failure here or there that has some type of failure mode, but that's usually because of what we call an infant failure mode, which basically means that you'll see it fail within the first few hours of operation.
It's not a lot different than your phone. If
No.
your iPhone's gonna fail, it'll fail unless you drop it in the toilet, right?
Yeah.
If your iPhone's
Don't do
gonna
that.
fail, don't do that. But if your iPhone's gonna fail, it's usually in the first 30 days. Outside of the first 30 days, unless something catastrophic happens to it, generally it's not gonna fail. A lot of electrical stuff is the same way. Like you could fray something, a switch could wear out, a brushless motor, but generally if a motor fails, something happened, it hit something like that. I'm not saying it's never ever happened,
Yeah.
but it's pretty uncommon.
So in short, expect to see failures in those other places long before you ever see a brushless motor failure. All right, I think this we're coming up to the end of the presentation here. This slide here, don't be alarmed. It kind of looks a little wordy, so never mind all that. It's really meant to serve as a quick reference. So all I'm trying to do here is show the different types of batteries out there currently and what that means in terms of cycle life for those batteries. You've probably heard about lithium iron phosphate, or LFP. These are batteries that are starting to show up more, especially in the EV industry. There's evidence of LFP chemistry even being used in OPE, but mostly for ZTRs because it's a much heavier chemistry than some of the others. On the plus side, it's a lower cost relative to the other chemistries, and it has a much higher cycle life, as you can see there on the right. So for Eagle Commercial, this is actually the chemistry that is powering our latest and greatest power bank portable charger, and it's what we'll use in our upcoming commercial ZTRs.
One of the battery options.
As far as the other three battery types listed, if you recall from our very first poll question at the beginning, they all use NCM or NCA, which stands for nickel manganese cobalt or nickel cobalt aluminum. But the difference between the three, as we discussed earlier, is just the form factor and size. So, biggest takeaway here lies in the scale you see on the right, which indicates that LFP delivers the best cycle life overall, followed by pouch and then tablets, and then you've got traditional lithium ion down at the bottom there. So you might ask, why wouldn't I just invest in pouch for everything? And honestly, the answer is pretty simple. It's because of the high cost. Pouch will have the highest cycle life overall, but it's also going to be the most expensive. And over time, your cost per watt hour is really going to play a big part in your overall business profitability, because again, batteries compromise a big part of the overall investment. Serviceability, another question I get a lot is, why doesn't Eagle make their batteries serviceable? And honestly, we've seen a lot of social media users, talk about this and provide a lot of conjecture, and they're very quick to assume that manufacturers are out there conspiring to not make batteries serviceable and therefore forcing people to have to buy new batteries over and over. To be perfectly honest, this is not the case. If we did have a technical solution to making servicing a battery easier, more cost effective, we would do it. We would absolutely do it.
Yeah, 100%.
But there's a number of reasons why this actually isn't the case. I'll keep this brief, but I'll give you kind of the quick highlights. Take our U56 volt battery. Consider our full range from 2.5 all the way up to 12 amp hour. Those batteries could have anywhere from 14 cells up to 192 individual cells inside it. So if any one of those cells at any point in time goes bad, imagine having to one, test, and then two, diagnose which of those cells were the culprits. Then imagine having to completely disassemble that battery pack and all the connections, solder points, that kind of thing, and then replace the bad cell or bad cells. That becomes a really challenging task that comes with a great deal of risk that nobody really wants to take on. And then to take a step further, when it comes to Eagle as an example, all cells in any one of our given batteries are matched at the factory to have a similar capacity, similar voltage, and internal resistance. That's really important to note, because it's how we can ensure that the entire battery behaves as a single unit all the time. So the moment you replace a cell with a cell that isn't quite matched in the same way, you immediately open up the potential for catastrophic failure. And since we don't like bad things to happen to any battery, we leave well enough alone for now until we can find a technical solution to get that done. So those are some of the reasons why. But not to worry, there are some things that you can do as a user, as a professional landscaper, to prolong the life of your battery. That said, I've got two basic recommendations. One has to do with temperature. The other one has to do with basically not charging to 100% every time. So let's talk about temperature real quick. Biggest recommendation here is just minimize temperature extremes. So for example, don't keep your batteries locked up in your truck or your trailer during the day, especially during the summer season, high heat, because extreme heat can damage the battery. If that's not an option for you, maybe because of you're concerned about theft, no worries. You can have some options. For example, if you can enable some kind of passive cooling, like air vents that you can cut a hole in the wall of your trailer. There are vents out there you can just pop in, or there's also active cooling options like a motorized fan that you could install in the roof of your trailer, plug it into your 12 volt cigarette lighter. Anything that keeps airflow moving is really going to be the best thing you can do to minimize that extreme heat. And then of course, when it comes to the winter, if you are transitioning to winter use, maybe you move a lot of snow with battery operated snow blowers, biggest recommendation there is just don't let your batteries sit anywhere where they can freeze. Batteries today, those cylindrical cells, they carry a liquid electrolyte. That liquid electrolyte can freeze, and when that freezes, bad things can happen. So keep your batteries out of freezing conditions. The other recommendation is don't always charge to 80%. Instead, charge to 80 or 90% instead of 100. Like our iPhones and Android devices, or even I've got an Apple Watch, you're actually given the option to charge to less than 100% in order to extend battery life. Not all manufacturers in the OPE world, would support this, but being given the option to do this is something that you can do already to extend the life of your batteries. This is actually a super cool feature that we have built into our Eagle PGX charging system, which very soon you'll be able to program using our Eagle Fleet app. All right, so this is our last slide in the presentation. Before we leave, just wanted to touch on some tips for a couple things: optimizing operator behavior, as well as call attention to some additional resources. So as far as optimizing operator behavior, it's very natural for users who are moving from gas-powered products to battery products to use those battery products in the same or similar way as the gas products. One thing in particular, the trigger and throttling. For example, string trimmers or edgers. Users will commonly throttle the trigger of a gas product while it's idle. Ultimately, this really wastes fuel over time. But when it comes to a battery product, you don't have that idling. And so you can simply shut the tool off when it's done, and then power right back on when it's time to work. So that can conserve energy. From an operating speeds perspective, this can be tricky from one product to another. For example, with leaf blowers or backpack blowers, the faster you're blowing, the faster you're going typically in order to get the job done. Walk behind mowers, a little bit different. That's where, it's going to be really worth the time to experiment. You got your travel speed, which is going to be what it is. You're not going to move any faster, with a battery operated walk behind than you would have, for example, with a gas. But it's really, the blade speed, right, that you want to watch, because, I don't know, how would you preface this, Conrad? Maintain the lowest speed possible while getting the results that you want.
Yeah, you just want to make sure you're sort of, yeah, like our commercial walk behind has adjustable blade speeds. It's really meant for some different applications. If you're just mulching, it actually mulches better and cuts a little bit more evenly at a little lower blade speed than at the high. So if you're using it to chop up leaves, run it on high. If you're using it to just cut a little devil strip at a bank, use it, don't maybe run at full blade speed. You get a bit more runtime out of it. Just it becomes pretty application specific, and get the result that you need, right? Like you hold yourselves to a high standard, but there's ways to sort of like optimize that, for sure.
Yeah, different customers may have different expectations, so this potentially creates an opportunity to conserve energy at times, right? Last point is pre and post route routines. An obvious one here is when you transition from gas to battery, you're no longer having to do things like mix 2-cycle fuel or refuel those fuel tanks, or even move those tanks on and off a trailer or in and out of a truck. Instead, they're going to have to make sure that discharge batteries at the end of the day are removed from the tools, and that they find their way to chargers, which will then need to be plugged in at the end of the workday. So definitely something to think about. Last but not least, some additional resources that we find to be particularly interesting and useful and probably helpful for you. American Green Zone Alliance, or AGZA, has some great training and certifications for even down to the operator level, so take advantage of that. And of course, there's Green Industry Pros. There you can find a lot of really great topics covered, and even the experts who can cover them very well. And then, of course, lawn and landscape, for all the above. So trying to wrap this up in a timely manner. So that concludes the presentation. And with that, we can move into a little Q&A.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for a great presentation. Just a couple questions for you from the audience. First, an attendee asks, are there going to be, or are there incentives available? They say that they're a small business owner, and to switch from gas to electric would be extremely stressful financially.
You don't have
we don't have anything.
We don't have
today,
any, but there's states out there, sometimes even at the city level.
I would say best thing to do is check with your local government, right, or municipality, see what options are maybe available out there.
We do have fleet pricing. So like our MSRP, you buy more, save more effectively, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you get from EGO in terms of better pricing. I wouldn't call it an incentive. It's more like a fleet pricing thing, which you're probably familiar with that language.
Yep.
There are sometimes, I'd say, statewide incentives or even, again, I've seen municipal incentives to help.
Depends on where you're at, right?
Depends where you're at.
Yeah, California
seems to be a lot of them. Out east, Connecticut, New Jersey, even some I've seen. Upstate New York.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go to EXA generally will have that information on who's giving out those incentives.
Yeah, so there are resources out there to investigate whether locally or at the national level or with your manufacturer and local dealer. So
Okay. Another question, somebody asks, will you be introducing solar solutions to your product line?
solar is an interesting one, and in short, not all users will benefit from solar in the same way. When you look at how solar actually works, there are parts of the country that have a high degree of solar radiance and parts of the country that have much lower. If you look at California, Southern Texas, Florida, much higher solar radiance, which means that your opportunity to collect and harness that energy and utilize it in a much more efficient way for a much broader scope of battery recharging is much greater than if you're located somewhere in the upper Midwest. It's just different. So we continue to explore solar options. You can probably expect to see something down the road, but as of right now, yeah, it's not appropriate for in all use cases, for all parts of the country.
Okay. Last question for you guys. How do you recommend landscapers handle pushback or skepticism from their employees out in the field when you're transitioning to electric equipment?
It could be taken in a couple different ways, I guess.
That's an interesting question. I like it. I mean, my thought is always you got to have them try the tools, right? And I always look at it as you're not going to convince everybody. Like even if someone's really dug in my experience, if someone has an open mind, they'll be like, you put a Ego string trimmer in their hands, like commercial string trimmer, they're going to be impressed. I believe that. Yeah, our walk behind mower, they're going to be impressed. But there's some people that don't want to be impressed, and so you won't win them all, right? So I think going to demos, working with dealers that have demo tools to use, and go about it that way. We have some really good dealer partners that are out there, like demoing a lot of stuff and showing you how PGX works and all the other kind of of using the tools. And we feel strongly that we'll win that battle sort of person by person. But ultimately I also know that can't win them all. Sometimes people are dug in on it, or I've been using it. I mean, I've seen landscapers that are so particular about something is like a shovel, like a crew where like everybody has their own shovel on the trailer and it's like marked with their name, and that shovel's my shovel, and because they've been using that shovel for 10 years and I don't know, so, or it's sharpened a particular way. So I try to remain a little bit pragmatic, about how that's going to be, but I do believe that if they try our stuff, that they'll be like, wow, this is more powerful than I thought it was going to be, and wow, this does a better job cutting grass than I thought it was going to be, and wow, this backpack blower is really good, and sweet, I use this hedge trimmer, I wasn't choking on 2-stroke. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's going to be a mixed bag for a while. With any evolutionary change, it's going to take some time. It just depends on where you're at and how the market is moving. Again, if you're out west, you might be forced to. If you live in other parts, give it some time. Or like Conrad said, trying is believing. The believability challenge is one that we continue to run across, and we handle that on a case-by-case basis. So.
There's a good battery question here. Is 80 to 90% charging for storage purposes, or is it problematic to charge all the way to 100% if you're immediately going to use the battery? I wouldn't call it problematic, but it's healthier for the battery. So you'll see like our boss has a Rivian, right? He charges it to like 80% because it's better for the battery health.
Well, thank you again to Nick and Conrad for such a wonderful job presenting today. And thanks to you, the viewers, for attending. Just as a reminder to all, the recording of today's webinar goes out within 7 to 10 business days. Thank you again so much for attending and listening, and we will catch you next time.